Welcome back, everybody. It's been a while, but now we are back at it again. Today's game is one that I've been actively keeping track of for over a year now, since its initial reveal trailer that debuted back in June 2020. A game by the name of Voidtrain. I'm sure you, like me, can just tell by just looking at the game that this is a very bizarre, otherworldly experience, but one that, if you're like me, instantly captures your attention with its visual aesthetic. And I suppose I should start there. One of the main focal points of this game is the immersion factor. Adventure is at the heart and soul of Voidtrain, and the game doesn't waste your time from the start. After a quick intro presented in a tongue-in-cheek style, the game throws you right into the action with you putting together the last few pieces of your very tiny train, really no bigger than a raft, and off you go through the portal into the great beyond. Voidtrain deliberately bypasses the traditional hand-holding tutorial we've all seen a million times in basically any other first-person game. Press W to walk forward, left mouse to use whatever happens to be in your hand, etc. Instead, for the first few hours, the game has you focus the majority of your time and attention on building a number of useful crafting stations and learning to unlock new buildings or crafting ingredients via a skill tree-like series of schematics you have to unlock by combining various items and resources, just as you would when crafting a building. It's an interesting system, as instead of allowing the player to freely tailor the order in which they want to pursue certain schematics as they would with skills on a normal skill tree, here you're limited to only working on a handful of schematics at a time, and only by completing them all will you unlock the next tier of schematics. And this is where we get into one of the main problems I have with the game, being its incredibly mind-bogglingly slow pace. Its tutorial, for example, if you're including all the various gameplay components this game gradually does introduce to you, will easily consume the first 6 to 10 hours you spend in Voidtrain. Just to be clear, I don't inherently have a problem with slower paced games. In fact, on average, I tend to prefer them. But it's been my experience that some slower paced games like Voidtrain tend to be a bit lazy in terms of how they manage their pacing. When I think slow paced, I imagine a game where there's always a lot to do, but no specific linear order nor a chronological deadline in which you have to get said things done, and where you have a variety of actions you can repeat on loop that inherently give off a certain amount of serotonin. One example that comes to mind, weirdly enough, is The Forest. After over 350 hours spent in-game in The Forest, I can definitively state that while The Forest is marketed quite clearly as a co-op multiplayer survival horror game, if you take away the horrifyingly disfigured humanoid abominations that inhabit the island and its underground areas, you end up spending a lot of time just cutting down trees, hunting for food, constructing buildings and useful items, etc. And just overall have a very relaxed and nonchalant experience. While there is a lot to do and a somewhat linear story you can experience, you're not really forced to commit to any one specific playstyle. And if you're marketing your game as this exploration-driven, play-your-own-way type game, there's a certain reasonable expectation from your consumer base that you deliver on that front. It'd be pretty fair, I think, to say that 90% of this game is essentially the same bland theme park ride experience, where you can easily mentally disengage in a Minecraft-esque way as long as you keep your eye out for resources. There are moments where you need to display a certain degree of in-game knowledge and memorization if you want to progress, but overall, more often than not, the game plays out for you rather than you playing the game. The train itself, especially in the earlier portions of the game, moves at a unbelievably borderline unbearably slow speed, which admittedly can be altered for brief periods of time once you unlock the steam engine and feed it an abundance of coal and water. But given how fast it uses up both, and the utter lack of any danger to run from as far as I can tell in my almost 30 hours of playing it, there really is no reason for you to even consider using it unless you have an unbearable amount of both coal and water that you're just looking to use up all in the span of a few minutes, just in order to clean out your inventory. Speaking of progression, let's talk about combat. While most of the game has this very procedural gameplay flow, every 20 minutes or so you reach this scripted sequence where you have to approach this enormous sci-fi trans-dimensional gateway, which effectively teleports you to these industrial facilities that are generally guarded by a decent number of enemy minions. I have to be careful in how I describe the minions because of our benevolent YouTube overlords, but they're basically the bad guys from the Wolfenstein games, if you know what I'm saying. Luckily for the player, they're about as accurate, dangerous, and competent as they are in basically any Indiana Jones movie, which is to say, not in the slightest. I can literally stand in the open taking enemy fire for maybe 15, 20, even 30 seconds without significantly endangering my character. Just before recording this review, I landed in one of these hostile occupied depots and faced off against over 20 enemies. At one point having over half a dozen enemies all firing into me, using a combination of pistols and semi-auto machine guns. I lost a total of 5 health. And while it's true I was wearing armor at the time, I played through I don't know how many depots so far where I wasn't wearing any armor, and I still maybe absorbed maybe 12 or 15 damage in total. So while it's true there might be some kind of 50 or 75% damage reduction while wearing armor, the amount of damage received compared with the number of bullets that successfully hit you is beyond ridiculously disproportional, to the point where your character appears to be more god than mortal being. I know, he's a man, not a god. Come on, comrade, he's a man, not a god. It does remind me heavily of Rambo, the video game, and the Rambo movies in general. But at least Rambo in the movies was actually a man, not a god. In this game, you actually feel more like a god than a man. Beyond these glaring balance issues, I have an enormous problem with the clunky and rather unenjoyable nature of combat. There is very little resembling any actual depth or substance in how combat is presented. In almost any FPS or action game in general where you really want the combat system to have a consistent and seamless flow, where instead of enacting a series of stop, go, stop, go, stop, go type actions, it's a fluid dance of sorts where you're too busy being in the moment to stop and reflect on other things. There's a reason why games like Doom Eternal continue to be enormously financially successful and overwhelmingly well received critically, as anyone with half the mental capacity of a Hell Knight can attest. You want the combat to feel good, and there's no one single way to get that done, but it's incredibly important that you do find a way to do that. And as the endless number of retro FPS clone games on Steam attest, you don't need to be a AAA game with hundreds of developers and a nearly unrestricted budget to make that happen. Your weapons have to feel responsive, bullet impact has to be felt through the animations and physics. The hitboxes for both yourself and the enemy have to be clearly defined and match the character model. And the amount of damage dealt has to feel proportional to the type of weapon it is, even when including any and all elements present at the time. All of that I just listed, none of it is implemented to any degree of competency in Voidtrain. While the game gets a lot of things in other areas right, the combat is so legitimately terrible it honestly at times does piss me off. I have, without any exaggeration, unloaded an entire clip's worth of headshots at point-blank range, and the enemy in question still somehow lives, despite me having stood so close to said enemy where I could literally leap forward and make out with him, if this was real life. In addition to the depot combat, you also have these optional arenas where you fight waves of the same AI alien monsters, which again is a pretty cool concept, but as ever lacks significantly in execution. This, if you haven't guessed yet, will become a running theme throughout this review. If you manage to complete one or more rounds in these arenas, you'll get rewarded with resources, although the actual amount and rarity does not scale upwards the more rounds you successfully complete, which makes the entire point of having an arena with scaling rewards almost meaningless. The combat AI is incredibly bare bones, and while I wouldn't expect anything near perfection from a game that's still in early access, the combat is quite mediocre even by early access standards. But the one single most important mechanic that Voidtrain markets itself around, beyond just raiding industrial bases, fighting in arenas, or even collecting pets, which are admittedly useless but adorable in a kind of ugly, hideous way, like Furbies, is the base building. And it's probably the one mechanic more than any other that I feel like I'm definitely on the fence about more than any other. There is ultimately very little, bordering on outright nothing, that you can build for no other reason than to provide cosmetic value or customization. Every buildable object on the train has its own purpose, and hardly any of them can be constructed more than once per train car. As if this isn't inherently bad enough, the game does an extremely poor job of explaining to you how to build or place anything. Once the game teaches you the basics within the first hour or two, it really backs away from showing you anything else. Even games like Minecraft, which has an incredibly complicated building system with an extremely wide assortment of devices and placeable objects, or The Forest, are both far more straightforward with their explanations. And I've heard the same tired old excuse of, well, it's an indie game, you're expecting too much from it. If expecting the game to cohesively make clear to the player what they're supposed to be doing, something games far smaller in scope and budget have been doing for decades now with no problem, you're just being intellectually dishonest in your defense, and ultimately are expecting too little from developers. And while I expect this will definitely get fixed in due time, it has not been fixed yet, and it's been weeks since the game initially launched, so I feel it's more than fair to criticize them at this point. Overall, while there are a lot of interesting mechanics that, if further expanded and refined, could greatly enhance the overall experience, it's the core game loop itself that most strongly holds the game back from coming anywhere close to meeting its full potential. And I do actually believe there is a lot of potential to be had here, but it's been weeks now since the game's initial launch, and little has really changed so far, at least in terms of addressing my main areas of concern. While there have been admittedly several updates that bring with them a variety of minor improvements, they pale in comparison with how much left the developers still need to address. If you're on the fence about buying Voidtrain, I'd honestly say keep it added to your wish list, and if you're going to buy it right now anyway, I would just say buyer beware. I'm very hopeful that the game could eventually, with a lot of changes over the course of early access, turn into one of my favorite games of this year, but it still has a long way to go and a lot to address before it can come close to meeting the rather high potential I believe it does have. On a side note, unrelated to the game itself, but rather its reception and community perspective, I do find it both jointly annoying and amusing to see diehard Toxic Steam fanboys desperately hurl verbal diarrhea at the developers for having the audacity to not release the game concurrently on Steam as well as Epic, setting aside the fact that the overwhelming majority of them probably wouldn't lift a finger to directly fund the developers. Now, of those that would, their collective input statistically wouldn't come anywhere close to what the developers probably got from Epic for signing their 1-year exclusivity pledge. I had hopped into one of the Steam discussion pages to get a question of mine answered by the community, and was only mildly surprised to see the discussion board was plastered by the unhinged radical partisan rage one might normally associate with a destructive cult. Do exclusivity deals suck, even timed ones? Absolutely, I don't think any reasonable person would deny that. But for many of these indie or AA type smaller studios, it's often a choice between player preference and keeping the lights on and their employees paid. Plus, with the promotion and visibility granted to them by the more restricted selection of games on the Epic Game Store, they can easily offset any minimal loss of sales from the snobby Steam-only elitists that will likely still not buy their game even when it does release on Steam a year later, and the game will inevitably be buried beneath a dumpster full of garbage within hours if not minutes of its release. If you really have to wonder why indie developers have been fleeing from Steam in favor of other platforms like Epic, you really need to be paying closer attention to the actual data and maybe talk to a few actual indie devs yourself before chiming in with your blistering and uninformed rage. If you're going to blame anyone for the exclusivity deals, blame Epic for offering them in the first place, because that's entirely fair. They're one of the biggest gaming corporations on the planet, and they have made the choice to go this exclusivity route, so really any criticism directed at that definitely is well warranted. While there's definitely a conversation to be had about Epic Game Store as a platform given its missing social features, its refusal to mandate product pages feature user reviews, etc., as well as debate surrounding the company behind it, let's not delude ourselves into seeing this as anything other than what it is. In the overwhelming majority of cases, it's yet another game that finds itself in the crossfire of a subsect of PC elitists interested in doing nothing more than using it as another footnote in their endless and ultimately pointless platform war, showing themselves to be no different than the console fanboys continuing their eternal PlayStation versus Xbox debate. And on that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. Likewise, if you want to see more videos like this one in the future, consider subscribing and clicking the bell to get notifications, so you can be among the first to know when a new video of mine goes live. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.